The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was the most powerful city-state in Middle America, and its rulers collected tribute from all the other tribes of central Mexico. The year was 1519. Aztec legend said that in this year, the priest-king Quetzalcoatl would return from the sun. Quetzalcoatl, with his fair hair and beard. Moctezuma II, emperor of the Aztecs, was increasingly upset by omens, signs which told of impending disaster for the Aztecs. What were these omens? Well, a rival ruler predicted that the land of the Aztecs would be ruled by strangers. He was so sure of himself that he bet his kingdom against 3 of Montezuma's fighting cocks. A ritual ball game was played to decide the winner, and Montezuma lost. Then, Aztec history tells us that hunters trapped a fabulous bird with a mirror in its head and brought it to Montezuma and his peers. First, Montezuma saw a sky in the mirror, and then he saw an army of soldiers. The people of Tenochtitlan were frightened. They felt that something was going to happen. And far away to the east, something was happening. Stirred by stories of gold and fabulous wealth, a small group of Spanish adventurers set sail in search of glory and gold. Their fleet landed first at Yucatan, and then sailed north to Tabasco. Their leader was Hernán Cortés, and he had a dream, not only of finding great wealth, but also of creating a new world utopia. Cortés would bring the religion of Spain to the Indians, and he would build a society based on the best elements of both civilizations. Thus, Cortés began a conflict between 2 cultures. In this lesson, we'll examine the conquest of Mexico. We'll look first at the military campaigns in which the Spaniards conquered the Aztecs, and then we'll discuss the effects of the Spanish conquest on the Indian cultures. Cortés had a stroke of luck at the beginning. At Tabasco, he met an extremely intelligent Indian girl. She spoke several Indian languages and she learned Spanish quickly. She accepted the Catholic faith of the Spaniards and joined their expedition. Her name was Malinche, and the Spaniards called her Marina. She became one of the strongest weapons the invaders had, for she understood the politics and hatreds that divided the tribes of Mexico. The fleet finally landed near the modern city of Veracruz, where Cortés set up his first headquarters. From there, a few hundred soldiers with some horses and cannons set out on their greatest adventure. Their goal, the conquest of the Indians of Mexico. Montezuma believed that Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl returning to Mexico, and the Aztecs reasoned that if Cortés were given gifts, he might be satisfied and leave. So they came to Veracruz with gold and feather work from Montezuma, but Cortés didn't leave. Malinche told him of the hatred other Indian tribes felt for the Aztecs. She advised Cortés to recruit Indian allies, and he was visited by the chiefs of a state anxious to be freed from their burden of tribute to the Aztecs. Cortés formed an alliance with these people. Accompanied by a few thousand Indian warriors, the Spaniards marched to the land of the Tlaxcalans, the bitterest enemies of the Aztecs. But the Tlaxcalans didn't welcome the invaders. Like people throughout Mexico, the Tlaxcalans were terrified by the sound of guns and the sight of horses. The Indians of Mexico had never seen such animals, and they thought that both man and horse were one creature. The Indian weapons were no match for Spanish guns and artillery and crossbows. Cortés defeated the Tlaxcalans easily and convinced them to join the campaign against the Aztecs. Montezuma, alarmed now, invited the Spanish invaders and their Indian allies to visit him at Tenochtitlan. At the gates of Tenochtitlan, Montezuma met the invading army. The troops were given a palace in the city, and Cortés was invited to stay at the emperor's palace. The Aztec ruler was a pleasant host. He entertained the invaders with elaborate festivals. But Cortés suspected Montezuma of treachery, and so the Aztec ruler was imprisoned. The Spaniards now control the city. But then Cortés returned to Veracruz for supplies. The people of Tenochtitlan revolted when the commander left in charge ordered the execution of 600 Aztec nobles. Cortés returned and tried to restore order. Perhaps he thought Moctezuma could control his people. Moctezuma was a victim of Cortés's plans. Aztec officials deposed Moctezuma and elected his brother Cuitlahuac emperor. Moctezuma, still convinced that Cortés was a god, tried to calm the people. But the Aztecs threw stones and shot arrows at their former ruler. A few days later, the wounded Moctezuma was strangled by his Spanish captors. In the vicious battle that followed, the Aztecs were victorious. 2/3 of the Spanish troops and many priests were killed. Many more Spaniards were wounded. The defeated Spaniards were forced to retreat from Tenochtitlan during the night, the Noche Triste, the sad night. And legend says that Hernán Cortés, defeated and discouraged, wept under this cypress tree. Had the Aztecs pursued their advantage that night, had they chased the Spaniards beyond the confines of their city, it's more than likely they would have destroyed the remnants of the Spanish army. But Hernán Cortés was a man of genius and determination. He led his men back to Tlaxcala to regroup, to get fresh supplies, to plan his next attack. Cortés would build a fleet of boats, take them apart, and rebuild them at Lake Texcoco. He would attack and blockade the city of Tenochtitlan from the lake, for he knew he couldn't capture the city by fighting his way across the heavily fortified causeways. The plan was successful. The Spaniards and their Indian allies destroyed the aqueduct, cutting off the fresh water supply to Tenochtitlan. They destroyed all the crops on the shores of the lake. They would starve out the numerically superior Aztec forces. The Aztecs were led by a new emperor, the heroic Cuauhtémoc, and they fought to the death, for they knew now that the Spaniards were not gods, but ruthless invaders intent upon destroying Aztec Mexico. Finally, with good luck, the Spaniards captured Cuauhtémoc. The Aztec ruler was brought to Cortés with full honors. Once the Aztec leader was imprisoned, the military conquest of Mexico was virtually complete. Tenochtitlan fell on August 13th, 1521. But how could a few men conquer an army of thousands? Well, it would be easy to say that Indian weapons were no match for Spanish guns and cannons, and this is certainly part of the reason Cortés and his men were able to conquer the Aztecs. But there were other reasons as well. First of all, the Indian allies of the Spaniards, the people who had suffered at the hands of the Aztecs, they furnished most of the infantry for the conquering forces. And they provided other vital services. They prepared and transported food supplies for the troops. They maintained lines of communication. And they policed occupied areas. Without their Indian allies, the Spaniards would have been unable to coordinate their activities. Another factor that contributed to the defeat of the Aztecs was psychological. Remember the omens that had disturbed Moctezuma? Because of these omens, the frightened Aztecs were convinced that they were doomed before the fighting started. The Aztecs appealed to their gods for rescue. Hundreds of victims were led to the sacrificial altars, but the gods were not appeased. Even when the Spaniards sacked the temples, destroying the idols and the altars, the Aztec gods remained silent. They did not strike the invaders, and the Indians began to lose faith in the powers of their gods. A third reason for the defeat of the Aztecs was that their concept of war differed from that of the Spaniards. Compared to Europe during this era, the Aztecs were a peaceful people. Only a few years earlier, the Spaniards had won back control of their peninsula from the Moors after 700 years of fighting. Countries all over Europe had been involved in bloody conflicts. During the Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries, European Christians had fought viciously to recover the Holy Land from the Muslims. There were other conflicts. England and France fought the 100 Years' War from 1338 to 1453. 2 years later, the War of the Roses began in England. In each case, the warring factions believed that to win, they must destroy the enemy. The Aztec concept of war was quite different. To the Indians of Mexico, war was a ceremony. The main purpose of each warrior was not to kill the enemy in battle, but to capture as many prisoners as possible. The Indians didn't understand the concept of total victory over an enemy. The political system of the Aztecs also contributed to their defeat. The Spaniards were able to take advantage of weaknesses in Aztec leadership. Remember, an emperor had no power unless he had the support of the tribal council. When Moctezuma was taken prisoner, the council abandoned him, and his power over the people disintegrated. Finally, the Spaniards conquered a sick and dying population. The Indians of Mexico had no immunity to diseases brought from Europe. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, typhoid were so frequent that between 1519 and 1650, 6/7 of the Indian population died. They died of the European diseases. And they also died of starvation. Even before the Spaniards arrived, the population of Mexico had begun to outgrow the available food supply. And there were severe famines in the early 16th century. The Spaniards put additional pressure on the land, and they introduced livestock to Mexico. Spaniards and Indians alike began to use valuable agricultural land to raise sheep and cattle. So, a combination of factors contributed to the defeat of the Aztecs. Superior Spanish weapons and the use of Indian allies, the fears of the Aztecs and their concept of war, the diseases imported by the Spaniards, and a shortage of food.